Good morning. The topic is the perfect church in front of us this morning, and it's not going to be just a soteriological discussion that I want to have with you this morning, but rather link it with, obviously, the topic of the conference, the church. Because, as I will tell you right away, soteriology and ecclesiology have more in common than you may think. It's because Adventism has always strived to become the perfect church. So we try to do it, and we are doing the church. The reasons, of course, for Adventists trying to be the perfect church are not only eschatological, even though it's in our name. Given that the pioneers have emerged from Radical Reformation roots, it is not surprising that we have this drive to sanctification and perfection, and it's always been part of our DNA makeup. Our inherited soteriology created at times problematic ecclesiology, though. The two main questions I'd like to consider this morning in the light of the theme of the conference are these. How do our inherited soteriological and particularly perfectionist paradigms shape our ecclesiology and consequently our mission? And how do we create balanced soteriology to help church and its mission? So, some very practical questions at the end as well. To start with, I would like to initially offer an insight into the varied influences that have shaped the core attitudes to perfectionism in Adventism and, in a sense, shaped the way the church looked like and behaved like. Perfectionist drive doesn't stem only from one tradition or theology. Actually, they grow out from multiple motivations within Adventism. And I would briefly introduce them, critique them briefly, and then towards the end of the paper offer, obviously, a reflection about ecclesiological implications as well. As we look at the history of Adventist soteriology, we would right away discover that on this matter, Adventists have not really invented the wheel. In fact, the early pioneers have, without any deeper investigation, essentially accepted the inherited traditional Protestant views of salvation with a distinctive Wesleyan or Methodist flavor. The pioneers had, however, never engaged in any sustained study of the question of salvation in the early years of the movement. We have no record of any meeting of them doing so, no record of the Bible conference or symposium on this topic. The most immediate influence on early Adventist soteriology was the Wesleyan one. The influence would largely come to Adventism through Ellen White's language, Ellen White's parents, as well as the young Ellen Harmon, and they were Methodists, obviously, before they joined the Millerite movement. She was familiar with the Wesleyan salvation concepts, and she had imported those concepts into Adventism, and we use them today very happily. If you look at fundamental belief number 14, it's just through and through from A to Z, completely Wesleyan in its structure, logic, and language. And we borrowed the language from Ellen White, by the way, in number 14. Now more specifically about Wesley's perfection. I will mention just very briefly his definition. We'll give you a slide about that, and we'll, in a nice three-step way, summarize his views. So, his definition is this. And this is from a famous sermon he preached on 1st of January at Oxford in 1733, when his movement was getting started. This is by John Wesley. So he says, it is that habitual disposition, perfection. It is that habitual disposition of the soul which in sacred writings is termed holiness, and which directly implies the being cleansed from sin. And then he says, oh, here then is the sum of the perfect law. This is the true circumcision of the heart. Let your soul be filled with an entire love of him, that you may love nothing but for his sake. It's quite dense, and obviously he discusses various aspects in his sermon. For our purposes, I say it's enough if we summarize his position under three main headings. Number one, Wesley's definition of perfection at its core is about internal love of God that rules the entire life of a believer. It's a kind of koinonia T.H. Lazic was speaking about. For John Wesley, unselfish love was the key Christian virtue, which the perfect possess. It is a well-known fact that Wesleyan Christianity is also a practical Christianity of love, and he insisted that also disputes must be done in love. And if that is missing in our discussions and controversies, disputes, then we cannot speak of sanctification or perfection. And this also explains why Ellen White, being a Wesleyan in her approach to salvation, was so unhappy about the spirit shown in the 1888 controversy, which was anything like the Spirit of Christ. So, internal love for God that rules the entire life of the believer. That's the first point of Wesley's perfection. Secondly, Wesley's perfection is not final or absolute. Perfect are never so perfect that they cannot grow even more. And perfect are never so perfect as to not fail from that state. His view of perfection is closely linked to his view of sin, which he defines in absolute and relative terms. In relative terms, it's our conscious separation from God. In this sense, we can be perfect in living in an unbroken relationship with God. And again, I think this is a kind of echo to his presentation this morning. But in the sense of absolute conformity to the perfect will of God, no man can be perfect, he insists. When Wesley speaks of the moment of perfection, he understands perfection in the first sense of unbroken relationship of love, which can start at any moment and then continue, can rule our life from that moment on. Nonetheless, his view of perfection at the end still presses one to complete eradication of sin, which is the last and the most controversial aspect of his soteriology. So Wesley's perfection is based on the idea of full eradication of sin. Not just suppression of sin. I will define these terms a little bit later. So there is either eradication of sin, we can speak in perfection, or suppression. He doesn't just suppress sin, but there is eradication of sin from one's life. That's also perfection for Wesley. Sin has to be eradicated. So this is the logic why now. Sin has to be eradicated from the soul before the soul meets its maker in the judgment. That's the logic here. And because in his theology, one meets the judgment at the point of death. When the soul leaves the body, the dying must be free from sin in the soul, if not in action, before the soul leaves the body. So it is evident that Wesley's emphasis on current perfection, why it has to be achieved in this life, is driven by his dualistic body-soul anthropology and consequently, if I may say so, skewed eschatology. The view that one meets the final judgment at the point of death because the soul at that point meets its maker. It is for these two reasons that for Wesley perfection was not an option but a necessity, a requirement that effectively became the passport to eternity. And obviously, if Ellen White uses the language of holiness, perfection, she also comes close to using the language of eradication of sin, even though she doesn't use the concept, as I will tell you. Now we can ask this question: is his perfectionist view, which was inherited by early Adventists, biblical? Adventism has drastically redefined human nature and eschatology, as we know, very early on. How should this impact what is doctrinally compatible to accept from Wesleyan perfection language and concepts? If we just mechanically run with Wesley's concepts of holiness without knowing the underlying reasons, then we may just create problems for church members and their spiritual journey. What this background exposes is that the notion of perfection, with its specific connotations, has come to Adventist vocabulary and thinking. Ellen White used the language very often, and when we encounter her statements on the subject, we have to remember the Wesleyan influence and definitions, but not necessarily the wholesale Wesleyan theology or rationale behind it. Thus, the emphasis on love and internal motivation of love is something that is more than compatible with Adventist theology and ecclesiology, and this should indeed positively resonate in our view of the church. However, what we should not do when we consider Ellen White's holiness language is to assume absolutistic definitions of perfection, which even Wesley had avoided. Neither should we blindly accept his aspect of eradication of sin before death, because it grows out of dualistic anthropology and skewed eschatology, which already the early pioneers have rejected. So we should listen with open theological ears and be wise about what we appropriate and what we reject. What we, however, cannot do is to avoid the fact that we have this language among our members and the members are using it. So we have to be wise how to address it. Apart from the Wesleyan influence on Adventist conceptions of perfection, there is yet another very important and often unrecognized influence which in significant ways shaped the way perfection began to be perceived from 1890s onwards. This influence does not stem from the views of Ellen White, from her language, or from the first pioneers either, but rather from the second generation of Adventist people, namely from a leading influential person by the name of A.T. Jones. The roots of A.T. Jones's charismatic perfection go back to what is called the Keswick movement. After he came to prominence in 1888, he became the editor of the Review and Herald periodical, and in this influential church periodical, he began to publish charismatic and holiness articles. Due to his interest in charismatic/holiness theology in 1890s. Actually, the late 19th century was a period of massive holiness revivals, and this influenced most of the evangelical churches, their view of themselves and the mission, of course. It may surprise you to learn that Jones would at times take whole articles from charismatic periodicals and just publish them in the Review and Herald. And he would write a note saying that this is actually Adventist theology, but they use fancy names, so just take it. By the mid-1890s, he created a great charismatic revival in Adventism. So the ecclesiology responded to his soteriology. In 1890s, he began to promote or propose that while we cannot achieve righteousness of Christ through our own effort, which was the core of the 1888 message, God can, he said, through the infilling of his Spirit in us. God will suppress sin in us to such a degree that it will be powerless. This way we gain perfect obedience and receive Christ's righteousness. To make this possible, one must show total surrender to God. So he talks about the suppressionist view of sin here, not eradicationist view. To back up his theory, he developed a specific view of Christ, in which he said that Jesus was just like us in his sinful nature. However, because of his faith, he was filled by God, and this is why he was victorious. We can have the same faith surrender experience when we are filled by God's Spirit, and God's Spirit will fill us fully, and we will be victorious too, just like Jesus was. To appreciate what has brought this change to his theology of salvation from 1888, let's say, and why he began to promote charismatic perfection, we need to turn our attention to the Keswick movement, which is the culprit behind it. Keswick Convention began to promote a higher life of faith. I don't know whether you knew it, but there is a lower life of faith and higher life of faith. So the Keswick Convention said, we'll tell you what's the higher life of faith here. They have developed a 7-step program which guided the individual to victory and blessing of suppressing sin fully. Not eradicating like Wesley had, but suppressing sin. And in the last stage of the program, one achieves complete and permanent sanctification, i.e. perfection, and the believer is completely transformed in the image of Jesus. There is neither sinning nor the desire to commit sin. At the heart of achieving spiritual victory is holiness by faith. What is holiness by faith? Holiness by faith is the act of complete surrender to God's will, looking away from oneself and trusting God. When believers surrender all to Him, God will literally possess such individual with His fullness. This is an esoteric like experience, which is described in strange terms in their writings, in strange terms of demonic possession and depersonalization, actually. It is very different from Wesley's model of practical, progressive sanctification emphasis. Ellen White does not come anywhere near the logic of the Keswick model, but A.T. Jones does explain his later understanding of righteousness precisely by the charismatic infilling and possession which suppresses sin and our personality as well, you may say, in us, and enables one to keep the law and receive righteousness of Christ. And maybe you have come across, through where you work, through your context, of a similar language and concepts. These are not from Ellen White. These are from Wesley. From A.T. Jones. The Keswick slogan was "Let go and let God." Nice one. It means surrender everything to God, have faith, i.e. higher faith in Him, let Him fill you completely and take over wholly. If you just fully trust He will do it, He will keep the sin within you and you can fulfill the law and receive God's righteousness. Once again, however, we can ask, or we should ask maybe, is this charismatic infilling model a biblical model and a compatible model with Adventist ecclesiology? And what does it do to our ecclesiology? Is Adventist ecclesiology charismatic? Do we have examples in our past where it became charismatic? And what happened? Is there in our theology of the great controversy room for God possessing people to the point where they are made to obey? Interestingly, some people during the late 1890s thought that such charismatic total surrender theology is compatible with Adventist ecclesiology. And you know what kind of forms of church it created. Even today, though, if I may say so, and I'll be a little bit naughty here. Even today, though, the hymns we sing officially during our worship services in the Adventist hymnal do collude to some degree with charismatic surrender theology of the Keswick. So here are some example of those hymns which contain full-fledged Keswick theology of total surrender and where sin is held captive in us. And we happily sing them without actually being bothered too much about those. So, there are at least two different versions of perfection that have informed Adventist thinking and shaped Adventist ecclesiology. The Wesleyan one is not quite this. Sometimes when we hear some of the nuances in these hymns we sing, we think of the Wesleyan type of salvation, but really when you analyze those hymns closely, you discover it's not a Wesleyan logic behind those. So Wesleyan is different from A.T. Jones's model of soteriology and perfectionism. They are not similar. They stand on very different foundations. Both of them have problematic aspects, but both of them have shaped the church and are shaping the church and our members significantly until this day. There is yet another type of perfectionism that is being promoted in the church, though, and this stands altogether on different foundations. So, let's complete the picture. And this is the famous one, Andreason's perfect last generation, perfectionism. This is a well-known and probably the most visible type of perfectionist view promoted today. Andreason's book, The Sanctuary Service, which contains the key chapter that outlines the perfect last generation theology, is still in print and is being sold by official Adventist houses around the world. The book came out first in 1937. The author himself was a Danish writer and theologian in the early decades of the 20th century. And in his perfectionist version, he moves beyond the Wesleyan and Keswick models and develops an understanding of perfection based on the mixture of various Ellen White statements, even though he rarely quotes from Ellen White, but more often paraphrases Ellen White. Essentially, Andreason's theology stands on the assumption that the atonement Jesus achieved on the cross is not sufficient for fully justifying God's government, the big issue of the great controversy, God's government. His act only paves the way for the last generation of believers living at the end time, when the crisis between God and Satan will reach its climax. The full vindication or justification of God's government will be achieved at that time through the perfect obedience to God's law in the lives of the last generation people or believers. Christ has shown the way, and the last generation will finish the justification of God. Now it immediately defines the parameters of our ecclesiology, our mission, very strongly. Underlying his theological framework is his view of Christ's sinful nature, which he borrowed from Jones, who first invented the logic. What is then perfection for Andreasen? Andreasen's type of perfection is a perfection which is the end result of gradual sanctification. So some similarity here with Wesley. A work of gradual eradication of sinful actions and habits from one's life. And this is where he differs from Wesley. When outward physical acts and the inner sinful tendencies are completely eradicated or overcome, he says, then one reaches perfection. One can even stand before God without Christ's mediation. And consequently, such will be the final demonstration to the universe that the law can be kept. It's very powerful. So there is a little bit of overlap with the Wesleyan notion of gradual sanctification, ending in perfection. But Wesley's focus was more on internal love motivation, the truest life, while Andreasen's is on outward habits, giving up habits. And his focus was on the law, doing the deeds of the law. Wesley was never so much focused on the law. Such perfect in the last generation finally vindicate God's government based on the obedience to his law, and as a result, God will stand vindicated and Satan will be defeated. So it's in the future. In this version of perfection, there is no charismatic enabling of our obedience to the law. Neither it is close to Wesley's perfection because his sanctification was not focused on the law obedience, Wesley's, but rather on internal love and relational perfection in the soul. Is Andreasen's version of perfection more biblical than the previous two then? Is this the kind of natural evolution of our perfectionist thinking, and so this is the best we have? Of course, many people do believe that. Is it closer to our, or indeed I should say, at the very center of Adventist ecclesiology and mission, as it pretends to be, and is taken by many as such? Now I leave these questions hanging because I will address them in my next section. Before we turn to the next section, let me just complete the picture and mention that the official Seventh-day Adventist statements on salvation do not mention the idea of perfection explicitly. The first ever official and published summary of faith, which appeared in 1932 at the time of Andreasen, in the church manual from page 180 onwards, does not contain the word or even explain the concept perfection. There are only hints and allusions to it, though. For example, a phrase, entire transformation of life and character, is used. But again, that was the kind of Wesleyan language they used at the time. The situation is similar in the latest version of our fundamental beliefs. Here's a question to you. Does this lack of direct reference to perfectionism in official Adventist statements of faith perhaps say to us that Adventist ecclesiology works well with sanctification and maturing of Christian character concepts, concepts which are very prominent in our statements, but not really with absolutist connotations of sanctification, which push soteriology into sinless position? Okay, let's turn to the next section. Let's do a little bit of a biblical theological reflection here before I do a kind of ecclesiological reflection. towards a biblical definition of perfection. There are 94 scriptural places where King James uses the English word perfect. The Hebrew root behind this English usage is tom and its derivatives, i.e. tamim, for example. And the Greek is teleos from the Greek telos. Now, the Hebrew tom or tamim has a number of different usages, and these essentially denote something other and less than ideal perfection, actually. Thus, for example, the Bible calls Noah in Genesis 6:9, Abraham, Genesis 17:1, or Job 1:1 and 1:8, perfect, even though they had obvious faults. Studies observe that the word translated in King James Version as perfect means rather integrity of mind or innocence. The word is used of simplicity of mind, which is opposed to mischief and ill design. And in terms of the Greek teleos and its derivative from the root, is a Greek derivative from the root telos, which means an end, a purpose, an aim, or a goal. Something is teleos if it fulfills the aim or its purpose. Transferred to people, they are perfect if they meet, let's say, God's purpose for them. Note, please, that teleos does not have the connotation of sinlessness. So this is as far as the basic lexical definitions and meanings are concerned. There are several key biblical passages in the Bible, obviously, where the idea of perfection appears. The most obvious passage is in Matthew 5:48. Be therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. I will just briefly suggest that it is not difficult to discover the meaning of the perfection in this text. Specifically, it is made in the context of love, as God has love for the enemies, his enemies, so also you love everybody else. You can love everybody else. And so we can be perfect in our love, in our attitudes towards those who appreciate us and those who do not appreciate us as well. The only other place in the Gospels where perfection is mentioned is in Matthew 19:16-21. This is the famous story of the rich young ruler. Here Jesus adds to the list of his accomplishments a call to loving action, to share his possessions with poor. And again, this is in the context of basic love. Notice the poor and do it. Don't do just the letter of the law, but actually go out and show kindness and mercy to those who are around you in need. The meaning of teleos from both and only gospel places is thus, you may say, mature or whole. Be whole in your love, as your Father in heaven is loving the whole world, the good and the bad. So also you learn to love even your enemies. This is teleos. Be whole and use your possessions in solidarity with others. The perfect disciple of Jesus is a mature, whole, and complete disciple. Perfection is not an absolute standard of flawlessness. Because if it was, then Abraham would not be called perfect. Now, as we move to the rest of the New Testament, there is something significant concerning the way New Testament writers think about salvation, which we must not overlook. On one hand, the long-promised Messiah of Israel came and brought salvation to people. Yet on the other hand, the full restoration of the creation, the full arrival of the kingdom of God, did not happen. And the New Testament writers develop a framework of thinking which we may call, or which is called, already and not yet, of salvation. It becomes the bedrock for New Testament theology and even ecclesiology. Without this framework, it is impossible to understand Pauline thinking on justification, sanctification, perfection, or glorification, or the role of the church and its mission. What this framework means is that there are some aspects of salvation which belong to the already, meaning the current experience of the church, and therefore the church and the believer is called to preach and practice them. Yet there are some aspects which belong to the not yet. That is to the time when Christ will come when he establishes his kingdom, then those will be experienced. The crucial question then is, for us, soteriologically and ecclesiologically, which belong where? What experiences belong to the already of salvation that the church preaches, calls people to, experiences, and which do not belong to the already, which belong to the not yet? Actually, the New Testament writers name them specifically, because those define essentially the parameters of the church community and its mission. The first and the obvious benefit of Christ's salvation, which extends to the present age, is forgiveness. It is mentioned numerous times in the New Testament as the present day, basic and necessary experience of God's people. Forgiveness is closely related by New Testament writers to conversion, change of mind, turning around one's life and thinking about God. The idea is mentioned together with confession. And you may say that these three, conversion, confession, forgiveness, are interwoven and are to be the believer's foundational salvation experience in this age. I mean, can you imagine the church without experiencing these aspects of salvation? These form the core experience of the believers and consequently give the church its primary mission. The church knows what to do. Call people to do this. Paul adds to the present experience of salvation, maybe metaphorically, circumcision of heart in Romans 2. This may be a metaphoric expression describing the same dynamic expressed by the word conversion. God has actually promised heart surgery since the time of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, and later repeated it through the prophets of Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And in Christ, this is now a possibility and a reality for those who respond to the Messiah. This is a powerful metaphor, circumcision of heart. Then obviously, faith is another major bedrock concept in the New Testament, and it's a present-day salvation gift. There is no need to demonstrate this. Baptism is another well-recognized and practiced aspect of experiencing salvation. Jesus himself has sent the church to baptize, so it defines the parameters of the church. Then fellowship in the church, partaking in the breaking of the bread, are mentioned as signs of the present experience of salvation, which the church experiences today. And they form actually the visible signs of the church community. Here, the way we think about salvation shapes directly the way the church looks like and what it says and does. Essentially, soteriology forms and informs ecclesiology. Reconciliation is another of the present-day salvation concepts to be experienced by the church, not just between God and people, the New Testament says, but also between man and woman, free and slave, Greek and Jew. What is this, if not a call to a particular mission the church ought to have also in the 21st century? Are we practicing reconciliation? And if we do, then how does it show in our mission? All of these aspects are demonstrating a concern which goes beyond an individual spirituality, actually. One's drive to growth is communal, inseparable from social and community concerns. Moreover, Paul mentions by name and more often by description sanctification. This is a big umbrella concept. There are many parts and aspects of this, such as prayer, Bible study, fasting, obedience to the law, taking care of the poor, the needy, and acting rightly and justly. People of the Messiah are called in the present to have those as part of their salvation and church experience. Furthermore, New Testament writers add at least two more metaphoric notions which express the reality of having the present-day experience of living with God. And these are walking in the Spirit and being in Christ. All these demonstrate that the Messiah has come, and the people's experience is the evidence of that in the church. The logic in the New Testament is, if you have the already experience of salvation, when Christ comes second time, you're going to get the second part as well, the not yet experience of salvation. So, what are those things which belong to the not yet of salvation? The New Testament is specific here too. The readers need to watch for the change of tense from present to future. For example, in Romans chapter 8, Paul begins to mention the not yet benefits from verse 18. He discusses for the most part the already aspects in his letter. But then there's a significant shift in language in chapter 8. And he discusses right away the not yet aspects. So, what does he mention? Well, he mentions something about the revelation, the full revelation of the sons and daughters of God. By the way, Andreasen misuses right away in the first paragraph of his chapter 21 in the sanctuary service when he quotes from Romans this text, which is in the not yet of salvation. He says, today God expects this. For Paul, it's in a not yet. He misuses Romans right away. Full revelation of the sons and daughters of God. Something of that should be visible in the church today, but not everything. Full restoration of creation, he mentions there. Redemption from the curse. He mentions glorification as another umbrella concept. In 1 Corinthians 15, in another not yet passage, he is adding resurrection. He says something about receiving new glorified bodies. Not a bodiless experience, but a transformation to our bodies. We clearly don't have it yet, right? Even though some people thought in the 1890s that they will have it. In Philippians 3:12, Paul mentions vindication. Sorry, he mentions perfection as well. It's coming up. Oh, sorry, I missed the perfection there. Should be perfection coming up. Paul mentions perfection. Revelation adds no more sin or death to it. But significantly, Paul in Romans frames his argument about justification between chapters 1 and 5 in future context as well, indicating the justification of believers, or their vindication, if you want, belongs to the not yet. People of God receive it in their final judgment, which, according to Daniel 7, will be given in favor of the saints, indicating that there will be vindicative justification judgment of God on behalf of his people. So, the New Testament salvation theology of already and not yet works actually very well with the Adventist conception of eschatology. There is simplicity and yet clarity when one begins to look at the New Testament salvation text through this framework. This is not an invention of theologians, but something that is necessitated by the gap between the first coming of the Messiah and the second coming of his kingdom. If one has the experience of the present salvation in the church, through the church, then he or she will also have the experience of the not yet of salvation. That's the basic logic here. We don't have the full salvific experience in the present age. But we have something here which defines the church as well and its mission. On the specific issue of perfection, Philippians 3:12-16 beautifully illustrates the point I'm trying to make. And Paul says, not as though I had already attained, either were already perfect, but I follow after, if that I may apprehend that for which also I am apprehended of Christ Jesus. Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching for unto those things which are before. I press forward the mark, for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Let us therefore, as many as be perfect, be thus minded, and if anything ye be otherwise minded, God shall reveal even this unto you. Nevertheless, whereto we have already attained, let us walk by the same rule. Let us mind the same thing. It's quite an extraordinary passage here by Paul, because he says two different things in one passage. On one hand, he says, I have not attained, right? You have the first bold. I count not myself have apprehended. He uses it interchangingly with the word teleos there, perfect. So I'm not yet perfect. I do not count myself to apprehend. Yet you read down, and it says, by the way, let us therefore, as many as be perfect, those of us who think they've done teleos, be mindful of. And then again he repeats, as if you missed him saying that, he again says, whereto we have already attained. Nevertheless, whereto? In those things where we have already attained, we have reached, then let us have the same mind. It's an interesting passage. He knows that there is, if I may say so, an already aspect of teleos, which is their mature attitude to Christ, and there is a not yet future aspect of teleos, in which they will achieve fullness, including new bodies without sin. And so he can live with this dichotomy. So there is a call and actually experience of maturity of Christian characters, our love attitudes, and acceptance, and those aspects in there already. And on the other hand, there is something he says, I count not myself to have apprehended yet, in some aspects. Thus, perfection as maturity of heart, motivation of love, and life orientation belongs to the present experience of salvation. And if we read Ellen White, then in this sense, then she would fit very well these descriptions. But teleos, in terms of eradication of sin, belongs to the future of God's people. This is where the New Testament authors keep it. It is therefore illegitimate to bring future aspects of salvation to the present experience of the church, as Wesley's eradication of sin view has done it, or as the charismatic spirit possession theology of A.T. Jones has done it, or as Andriesen's perfect last generation theology has done it. Such swapping, if I may say so, messes up not only our theology of salvation and spoils our individual Christian experience, but also messes up the nature of the church community and its primary message and mission. It messes up koinonia. It messes up the unifying love of the church. So, in the final analysis, I would like to propose to embed the New Testament framework of already and not yet in our discussions on salvation, and I suggest then it will healthily and helpfully inform our ecclesiological discussions too. It will have a very healthy impact on our ecclesiology as well. And overall, this will help us to avoid perfectionist excesses on one hand, and on the other hand, define biblically what the church is and what its main mission in the world ought to be today. Thank you.
I believe there are still, as you mentioned yourself, various shades of perfectionism within Adventism. My first question is, how is that impacting the church? And my second question is, eradication of sin belongs to the future of God's people. What do you mean by the future of God's people? When is that future going to be?
Okay, the second is easy to answer right away. So after the second coming, when that's what I mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, the context as well, with the resurrection, then eradication of sin. And obviously, within the larger context of eschatology, the full eradication happens after God cleans the whole earth from sin and the sinners. So the first question, where do you see the impact? Was this the question? Where do you see the impact of perfectionist thinking?
Yes. Obviously, there are still within Adventism various shades of perfectionism. We are well aware of that. All right. Is that affecting the church? Is there an impact on the church? And if so, how would you describe it?
Yes. So this is one of my questions to you. So I'm not going to answer the question. I will ask you the question to discuss. One of the questions will be, where do you see this happening? Do you have your own experience with this? I can only mention that I see the impact of perfectionist thinking in different shades on focusing on individual spirituality concerns and being oblivious to a larger communal concerns. So then, you go to church because you want to be cleansed. You are working on your cleansing. And so the cleansing of somebody else is kind of less of your concern. And how can you do effectively koinonia if you have the mindset like this? And Wesley knows about the experience because in the first part of his life, actually, Wesley was focused on getting the perfection fully done. Then he changed to the internal motivation of love. But he became very dry, he says, in his life, very self-concerned, self-interested. And even though he would go to a mission to Georgia and try to convince the local people there, he would struggle with that mission because he says at the end, when I later thought about the experience, I was self-concerned. And so it has impact. But I want you to discuss as well what kind of impact.
How do we handle what Ellen White says in Great Controversy in the investigative judgment, where she talks about the sealing and the time of the end, the Holy Spirit will be withdrawn. You've got to be perfect before that time comes or you'll be lost. This scared me witless in my youth in the 1950s, which was very strong in the church at that time. I had great fear. I had no assurance at all.
So the question is about the judgment of God specifically, or?
Yes, her comment that she makes, you've got to be perfect before the Holy Spirit is withdrawn.
So I would say 2 points maybe on this question of Ellen White and reading her perfectionist statements. One is that, of course, that there is the immediate context where she writes something, and oftentimes the context is very helpful. A typical example is Christ Object Lessons, page 69, where some sections are taken out, but if you read in the context, she speaks about the perfection in terms of the mission of the church, what the church can do. This is why the members also should be part of that. So I would look into the context first. And secondly, I would suggest this, that I believe Ellen White's chapter 47 in Prophets and Kings is the hermeneutical key to perfectionist debates in Ellen White. It's an incredibly structured chapter in terms of the logic, what she does, and she addresses the question of the judgment. She takes the issue of the high priest at the time, and he was not in his clean clothes in front of God. Yes, and so she explains how one gets the cloth of righteousness, the clean cloth of righteousness, and she basically the whole argument is based on they have faith in me. Satan accuses them 3 times. There's a repetition in the chapter 3 times. There's a historical repetition, the original historical situation. There's a throughout history situation, and at the end of the time situation as well. In all 3 contexts, she says the same thing. God's people have their problems. They are selfish. They do this and that. Yet, then she says, they have faith and trust, and they've been forgiven, and they know that. I would suggest this is a very late chapter. It's the most systematic piece on perfectionism, last judgment, these issues in Ellen White. And I'm surprised we in Adventism have barely noticed it. It's incredibly well done, actually, if you look at the structure of the chapter. Chapter 47,
Prophets and
Kings.
Published shortly before her death.
And actually, yes, some of the sections of the book were finished after she died, but this one was finished before she died. I have a paper, I'm not sure if it's on Academia, EDU, if you want to check out, where I discuss it, actually.
When I work with students, usually the text there are many texts from the Bible that I throw back at me, like bride that should be spotless before Christ comes, and Thessalonians 5:23, let your spirit and mind, body be kept perfect or spotless, yeah? But the favorite text from Ellen G. White was that Christ promises that when his character is perfectly revealed in his people, then he will come. That always comes by default in every conversation. So I'm just curious, if you were given this question, how do you usually answer that?
Yeah, so Christ object lesson 69. And as I said, beautifully, in the chapter, the context is a mission. And she speaks about the harvest, reaping the harvest, how the seed grows from a small plant and then reaches full harvest. And she says, this is essentially a call to Christian maturity of characters. The kinder we are in the context, the more loving, in the context, then more effective we will be. And this is what actually makes the harvest of God, He's working through the church, far more effective. This is the context. And I discuss this with students specifically when I teach the class. And you can very nicely show this in the context. But we take those texts out and we assume then sinless connotations, as I said. But not even Ellen White, as I try to tell you, she necessarily went for the sinless connotation, even though she uses the Wesleyan language, not her logic, not his logic necessarily. So we need to be able to explain slowly and nicely to students, to people, the Wesleyan background, her language, where she goes with her concept, the maturity of character, beautifully. It's in the chapter, but then she doesn't go to the kind of eradication of sin space.
Thank you for your paper and for your thoughts here. Let me challenge you a little bit more here and connect some dots together. You said regarding Wesley's theology that his understanding of perfection is the full eradication of sin to some extent before death, because at the moment of death there is the immediate judgment, it's personal eschatology, and a Christian has to reach the point of perfection to be able to stand before God and have the judgment. That's Wesley's theology. But then I go back to those same statements here that have been mentioned a number of times, great controversy, where Ellen White says that before the end of the time of probation, there's going to be a generation that will stand before God without any sin, so that they will be able to stand during the end of the time of probation. Isn't that a more radical view of eschatology and of perfection than even Wesley has? Because Wesley says, you've got until you die. But Ellen White says, no, it's not until you die. It's until the time of the judgment begins. And you've got to reach that. It's even more radical and more serious. And the connection we've done with that in eschatology, in ecclesiology, in our doctrine of the church, is that we often have a context within our churches where we will kind of look at each other and we will kind of judge one another. Are you as perfect as you need to be in order to be that last generation? That perfectionism influences how we do church. We kind of condemn one another. Are you still eating this? Are you still drinking that? Are you still watching this? And you're not really perfect. So how do you relate all these points there? Isn't our ecclesiology based upon an understanding of perfection?
Now what I would say is that once again, she's Wesleyan in her language, and we need to recognize this. And she may even be provocative in her language. But hermeneutically speaking, you need to be able to recognize chapter 47, which is the most systematic exposition. It's not just one paragraph. Statements here and there. It's a very systematic exposition of the big issues of who can stand in front of the righteous God. Joshua the high priest is in filthy robes. On what basis he stands? Throughout the ages, Christians who waited and trusted the Lord, on what basis do they stand? And then she moves to the last section. We stand, the last generation of people, they stand on what basis? And it's always the same answer. They have faith. And she even says they are aware of their faults. They are massively aware of their weaknesses. Satan knows it, he accuses them. They themselves know, they blame themselves. Christ knows it, he doesn't blame them. On one condition. So there needs to be a kind of hermeneutical context here. Otherwise, everybody will read connotations into these radical statements of Ellen White. And I yet have to see, honestly, a kind of serious exposition, maybe I missed it, in Adventism, that digs into this, because it's an incredible chapter. And just like we had a discussion about the sinful human nature of Christ and the Baker letter, which helped us to sort out the language, I suggest chapter 47 could be this place. So I see this as a radical language, Wesleyan language, but I don't hear those connotations, because in the overall picture, it doesn't make sense in Ellen White.
In other words, if you already have M.L. Andreassen's theology in your head and come to that chapter in Great Controversy, then you see it there. But if you know the background, it's not there. Like in Acts 20, Paul says about Eutychus, when he dropped dead, oh, don't worry, his soul is still in him. Now, if you have the medieval picture, you see the immortal soul escaping, but at the last moment he clasped it between his teeth, and now we are going to push the soul back. But if you have the biblical anthropology, there's no problem with Acts 20. You don't see it there. So once you have the understanding of the development from Luther to Wesley, to Keswick, to Andreasen, then you don't see it there. But if all you've got is a folklore reading of Andreasen, you are going to see it all over Ellen White and reading into Ellen White while it's not there.
And if I just may add, we oftentimes do try to read Ellen White in context, but that context is sometimes insufficient. And for example, in Great Controversy, she makes several points across several chapters, and you have to read through 3 or 4 chapters to get the point. And if you just pick up on some issues, then you will not get the point that she's making. For example, about the Jacob's time of trouble. You have to read the last paragraph in the previous chapter to get what she says about the Jacob's trouble, time of trouble, which is about a big crowd which comes out and they benefit mostly from the experience. She describes the church as already being driven by holy zeal, and they have the sanctification experience there. But it's the large crowd, the new people who join, they then benefit specifically.
All right, let's go to Kalervo and then to Sigve.
Thank you for the lecture. Closely connected with it is perfectionist, the idea of salvation. So, since we are talking about salvation, what do we really mean with that? We speak about salvation, but we rarely ever elaborate what it means.
Yeah, so I just used the generic term of basically having the experience as I showed on the screen, the reconciliation with God experience, if I may say so. Because salvation is a dogmatic term, of course, you may say. So it's a dogmatized term, and different people can imagine different things. This is why I try to kind of break it down to specific terms that the New Testament authors specifically use. So that's what I meant by salvation, having this sort of experience.
Just a comment. I may have my facts wrong here, but I think Ellen G. White wrote the book, The Sanctified Life, as a response to the holiness theology in Adventism in the 1890s. And what has struck me, and I have read that book many times, is there is a sort of depth perspective that when you pursue sinlessness and you have to monitor that you are succeeding in that pursuit, you are in some ways traveling in the wrong direction, because growth in grace, in Ellen White's perspective, is an increasing awareness of sinfulness. Mm-hmm. I cannot say, I am sinless, till this vile body is changed and fashioned like unto his glorious body. You know, so I think that's just adding to your chapter there and prophets and kings. That's helpful. I want to make a pitch for Wesleyanism, Wesleyan hymnody, because there is a yearning in the Wesleyan experience, in the Methodist experience, that is worth having. It's not something one would like to abandon, and yes, I don't know if some of those hymns you had were Wesleyan hymns. I suppose some of them were. There is one that Charles Wesley thought that this was his best hymn. It's a hymn called Wrestling Jacob. It used to be in the Adventist, early Advent hymnal, but it is not in our hymnals anymore. It's about Jacob's struggle to face, his end-of-life type of experience. Come, O thou traveler unknown, whom still I hope, but cannot see. My company before is gone, and I am left alone with thee. With thee all night I mean to stay, and wrestle till the break of day. I need not tell you who I am, my sin and misery declare. Look at thy hands and read it there, thyself has called me by thy name. But who, I ask you, who art thou? Tell me thy name, and tell me now. To discover what God is like is in some ways in the Wesleyan experience then the highest point of, a vision of God in a sort of growth in grace and holiness and so on. So I think the Adventist perfectionism has made Adventism very, very shallow. And we just have to find a way to extricate ourselves from that shallowness and still not give up the yearning for growth.
Yes, maybe what happened is that very early on, of course, our soteriology got these perfectionist notions from Ellen White, and they were Wesleyan notions with the view of internal love and precisely those things of graciousness. But later on, through A.T. Jones's change of terminology and emphasis, and later Andreasen's very strong perfectionist theology, we simply assume then, as Daniel said as well, when we read Ellen White, we assumed kind of different language, not her conceptual world, but the world of A.T. Jones or Emil Andreasen. And this is plaguing us, I think, as you say, in our souls.
Jan, first of all, thank you for the presentation. Then in a short time you was able to present it. The second sentence, but tell us in terms of eradication of sin belongs to the future of God's people. This is true, but we can have the victory today, now. And we are growing, and God is taking from us some weakness. This is not only experience which we are looking forward, but we could today have the experience with the relation with God. Because of His power, I can change, but it is His power. So we are not only looking to the future, and we can excuse I am because in the future God will change me. Today I don't need to be changed.
Yeah, but that's what I try to say. Also, giving the text from Philippians by Paul, saying, I have this teleos, but actually I don't count myself as achieving full apprehension yet. So it's typical Wesleyan, and it comes, maybe you missed this at the beginning, that Wesley's view of sin was both absolutist terms, and in those terms one cannot achieve perfection or eradication in this life, but in relative terms of sin, which is about our unbroken relationship with God, we can and we grow in that into full maturity. So in this sense, yes, but in a sense of full eradication of sin, when there is no more sin, you can't. Can you grow back your hair? Can you have today in this life a body that is what Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15, glorified body? Even though you try spiritually very hard, can you do it back? No, we can't. So this is the kind of meaning I had in mind here.
Thank you, Jan. I used to be perfect, thinking about my spiritual life all the years back. And now that I understand faith as developing in stages and as we grow and mature, do you think maybe we will always have this challenge of perfectionism in our church because we tend to keep our church at a more immature level of faith development?
We can't get rid of our heritage, our language heritage, and so Ellen White always will be important to Adventism, and the language will be there, and there will be also the Andrew Essen's influence and his language, and A.T. Jones's language. So we're going to have the challenge of explaining things, and we have to do the best we can, and maybe this is why we have this conference as well. And maybe this is why George Knight wrote his book, I Used to Be Perfect, as well, and other people try to discuss this and educate people on this matter. But if you frame the concept, if you frame the salvation for you in terms of the language, the metaphors I try to give you from the New Testament, it takes away the pressure from you on actually doing what you are not supposed to be doing. You are focusing on those terms and those concepts and experiencing a meaningful life. You may feel, as Zygmunt said, and Ellen White says it, very often, that the closer you come to Christ, the more you experience grace, the less you feel adequate. This is exactly in chapter 47, the experience of the people of God, she mentions in Prophets and Kings. So we probably will never be able to get rid of this experience, but we have to do a lot of education, that's for sure.
There was just one issue which happened to me, and I think many Adventists struggle with it, is assurance. Yeah, because I've talked to people who are dying, there's just a few hours, say, you're saved in Jesus. Well, I don't know if I've done enough. It strikes me a lot of Adventists cannot say, well, I'm a child of God, I'm saved. Is that wrong?
So I would ask people, do you experience forgiveness? Did you have your baptism? Do you pray? Do you walk with God today? Do you experience conversion? If you have A, you can go to your grave with full confidence, assurance. As Paul says, I have kept the faith, I fought the fight. He goes into his last days with incredible assurance, confidence that he walked today and God has done the circumcision on his heart. And his life, what he was doing, what he was experiencing was the A part, and the B part will come. So if you change the metaphors, the language, then it brings assurance. Of course, if you mess up explaining perfection, then it creates uncertainty as well.